The scent of lemon soap and lye clung to Alara's skin, a permanent perfume that no amount of scrubbing could ever fully erase. It was the scent of her station, of her invisibility. In the grand ballroom of the Obsidian Fang Pack, amidst the heady aromas of roasted boar, spiced wine, and the cloying floral perfumes of the court ladies, her own scent was a nullity. She was a ghost in a gray servant's dress, her head bowed and her hands raw, moving through the splendor like a shadow. Her world had been silent for 6 years, not by choice, but by a vow sealed in blood and tears, a magical lock upon her tongue. To speak would be to condemn her 6 brothers to an eternity as swans, their human forms lost forever, to a witch's curse. And so, Alara remained mute, her thoughts a raging river trapped behind the dam of her lips. Tonight, the river was a tempest. Alpha King Kalen sat upon his throne-like chair on the dais, a figure of raw power and breathtaking authority. He was the ruler of these lands, the alpha of all alphas, and the man who had conquered her kingdom 6 years ago. He was, to her, the embodiment of her family's ruin. And yet, her foolish heart hammered against her ribs whenever he was near. His scent cut through the ballroom's chaotic bouquet with the sharpness of an axe. Pine and winter frost, with an undercurrent of ozone, like the air after a lightning strike. It was a scent that promised both safety and danger, a scent her wolf, dormant and grieving deep within her, recognized with a painful, yearning tremor. Mate. The word was a whisper in her soul, a cruel joke played by the fates. Her mate was the king who held her brothers captive in their feathered forms, the man who would never look twice at a mute servant girl scrubbing his floors. He laughed at something one of his advisors said, the sound a low rumble that vibrated through the stone floor and up into Alara's bones. His amber eyes, flecked with gold, swept across the room, dismissive of the fawning nobles and hopeful she-wolves vying for his attention. He looked bored. He looked burdened. For a fleeting moment, her anger warred with a strange pang of sympathy. The weight of a crown had to be a heavy one. Her focus sharpened on the woman who had just approached him, gliding through the crowd like a venomous snake, Lady Seraphina. Her scent was of night-blooming jasmine and something else, something cloying and artificial that always made the back of Alara's throat itch. It was the smell of dark magic. Seraphina leaned close to the king, her red lips whispering in his ear, her hand resting possessively on his arm. A low growl rumbled in Alara's chest, so quiet no one could hear it. Jealousy was a bitter, useless emotion, but it coiled in her stomach like a living thing. Kalen didn't push Seraphina away, though a muscle in his jaw tightened. The council was pressuring him to choose a mate, to secure his lineage. Lady Seraphina, with her powerful family and political connections, was the logical choice, the perfect choice. Alara forced her attention back to her task, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle of her wooden bucket. She was here to work, to remain unseen, to survive until she could finish her task. Every night, in the secret solitude of her tiny attic room, she worked on the only thing that mattered, 6 shirts woven from the fibers of stinging nettles. Her hands were a testament to her devotion, covered in blisters and scars from the vicious plants. 6 shirts for 6 brothers. It was the only way to break the curse. Only then could she speak. Only then could she be free. She was refilling a pitcher from a large cask of wine when she saw it. Lady Seraphina, her back to most of the room, deftly uncorked a tiny vial and tipped its contents into King Kalen's goblet. The liquid was viscous and shimmered with an unnatural pinkish hue. Alara's blood ran cold. A love potion, a powerful one, judging by the sickly, sweet scent that now tainted the air around the dais. Panic seized her. She couldn't shout a warning. She couldn't run to an advisor and explain. They would see only a hysterical servant girl, and by the time they believed her, it would be too late. Kalen was lifting the goblet, his attention on the ambassador from the southern Pax. There was no time to think. There was only instinct. Alara moved. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror and resolve. With a tray of fresh goblets balanced on one hand, she propelled herself forward, aiming for the space just before the dais. She didn't need to be graceful. She only needed to be effective. 3 steps. 2. 1. She let her ankle twist. A believable, clumsy motion. The tray of goblets went flying, a shower of shattering crystal that drew a collective gasp from the nearby nobles. Her body followed, a carefully orchestrated fall. She crashed into the small table beside the king's chair, her arm sending the tainted goblet of wine spinning through the air. Dark red liquid arced, splashing across the stone floor and, most satisfyingly, all over the hem of Lady Seraphina's pristine silk gown. A stunned silence fell over the ballroom. Then, a furious shriek from Seraphina. Alara, sprawled on the floor amidst the wreckage, didn't dare look up. She kept her head bowed, her hair falling over her face to hide the fierce, triumphant satisfaction in her eyes. The scent of the spilled wine was sharp, but beneath it, the cloying sweetness of the potion was unmistakable. It had been close, too close. "You clumsy little fool," Seraphina hissed, her voice dripping with venom. But Alara wasn't listening to her. She was focused on the heavy silence that emanated from the throne. She could feel his gaze on her, a palpable weight. The scent of pine and frost intensified, now laced with something sharp and questioning. He was looking at her, truly looking at her for the first time. "Enough, Seraphina." The king's voice cut through the air, low and commanding. It held no warmth, only cold authority. Heavy boots stopped right beside her. Alara squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable dismissal, the fury of a king whose feast had been so publicly disrupted. She prepared for the feel of a guard's hand on her arm, ready to be dragged away to the dungeons. Instead, a large, warm hand grasped her chin, tilting her face upwards. Her breath hitched. She was forced to meet his eyes. Up close, they were even more stunning, a molten gold that seemed to see right through her carefully constructed walls. He wasn't angry. His expression was one of intense, unnerving curiosity. His gaze flickered from her eyes, down to her trembling lips, and back again. He leaned closer, and his scent enveloped her, intoxicating and overwhelming. "Mine," her inner wolf howled, a desperate, painful cry. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice a quiet rumble meant only for her. Alara could only stare back, the silence her shield and her prison. The name Alara was a fire on her tongue, a word she was forbidden to speak. Her heart broke a little more as she gave him the only answer she could, a helpless, desperate shake of her head. King Kalen's thumb brushed lightly against her chin, the calloused skin sending a jolt of lightning through her entire body. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in sharp, analytical assessment. He was searching for something in her face. Deceit, fear, defiance. She wondered what he found in the wide, terrified eyes of a mute servant girl. "She cannot speak, Your Majesty," a reedy voice interjected. Steward Boren, a man whose spine was as rigid as the ledgers he kept, stepped forward. His scent was dry and dusty, like old parchment and disapproval. "She has been in the castle's service for 6 years, mute since the day she arrived. She is called, well, she has no name. We simply call her the Quiet One." The king's gaze didn't leave hers. The information seemed to intrigue him, rather than deter him. A slow, dangerous smile touched the corner of his mouth. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a predator who had just found a fascinating new puzzle. The quiet one, he mused, his voice a low purr. He finally released her, and the absence of his touch left her skin feeling cold and exposed. He rose to his full, intimidating height, towering over her. It seems her actions are louder than any words. She has ruined your gown, Lady Seraphina, and disrupted my court. A severe punishment is in order. Elara's stomach plummeted. She pushed herself into a sitting position, her head bowed again, bracing for the sentence. The dungeons, the lash, banishment. However, Kalen continued, a thoughtful tone in his voice, I am feeling merciful. He paused, letting the tension in the room build. Such clumsiness should not be left to roam the halls. It is a danger to my guests and my wine. The slight emphasis on the last word sent a shiver down her spine. Did he suspect, or was she imagining it? From now on, she will be confined to my personal chambers. She will serve as my attendant. She will bring my meals, clean my rooms, and see to my needs. That way, any future accidents will only affect me. A collective, disbelieving murmur rippled through the court. Lady Seraphina's gasp was the loudest. Elara's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. His personal attendant? It was not a punishment. It was an elevation, a position of trust. It was forced proximity. It was a death sentence for her already fragile composure. Your Majesty, that is hardly a punishment, Seraphina protested, her voice shrill. She is a clumsy, nameless nobody. You cannot possibly mean to have her in your private quarters. Kalen's gaze turned to Seraphina, and the temperature in the room dropped by 20 degrees. The playful curiosity was gone, replaced by the chilling authority of the Alpha King. I mean precisely what I say, Lady Seraphina. Are you questioning my judgment? Seraphina paled, her mouth snapping shut. No, Your Majesty. Of course not. Good. He turned his attention back to Elara, who was still frozen on the floor. You will report to my chambers at sunrise. Steward Boren will see you are given a new uniform, one befitting your new station. He gave a curt nod. The feast is concluded. Guards, clear the hall. With that, he turned and strode from the room, his black cloak swirling behind him like the wings of a great raven. The scent of pine and frost lingered in his wake, a promise and a threat. Elara was left in the suddenly chaotic ballroom, the center of 100 whispered conversations and hostile glares. Lena, her only friend among the servants, rushed to her side, helping her to her feet. Are you mad? Lena hissed, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. She smelled of bread, dough, and loyalty. His personal attendant. Elara, do you know what they'll say? Elara could only shake her head, her mind reeling. She knew exactly what they would say. They would assume the king had taken a fancy to her, that she was to be his bed warmer, a passing amusement. The scorn from the other servants and the fury from the court ladies would be unbearable. But worse than that was the terrifying reality of being near him every single day. How was she supposed to maintain her composure, to hide the truth of her identity and the secret agony of her curse, when the man her very soul screamed for was just a breath away? How could she focus on weaving her brother's salvation when her mate was a constant, devastating distraction? Steward Boren approached, his lips pursed in a thin line of distaste. Come with me. The king's orders must be followed, however. Perplexing. He led her away from the gossiping crowd, his disapproval a palpable force. He gave her a new uniform, not the rough gray linen of a scullery maid, but a soft, dark blue dress with a simple white apron. It was still a servant's attire, but the fabric was finer, the cut more respectable. As she changed in the small servants' changing room, her hands trembled. She touched the faint scars on her palms, the reminders of the stinging nettles. 5 shirts were complete, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her attic room. 1 more to go. The final, most difficult shirt. She was so close. This new development, this forced intimacy with the king, was a complication she could not afford. The next morning, she arrived at the king's chambers as the first rays of dawn painted the sky in shades of rose and gold. She knocked softly on the heavy oak door. "Enter," his voice commanded from within. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The rooms were vast, larger than the entire cottage she had grown up in. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, a low fire crackling merrily within. Furs were draped over heavy wooden furniture, and shelves were crammed with books and scrolls. The air was thick with his scent, undiluted by the perfumes and cook fires of the main castle. It was overwhelming, and she felt her knees weaken. He was standing by the large window, already dressed in black breeches and a simple white tunic that strained across his broad shoulders. He was looking out over the training grounds, but he turned as she entered. "Good, you're punctual," he said. His amber eyes scanned her from head to toe, taking in the new dress. A flicker of something approval, possession, flashed in their depths before it was gone. "There is a tray outside the door. Bring me my breakfast." She nodded, her heart thudding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She curtsied awkwardly and retreated to fetch the tray. When she returned, she placed it on a small table near the fire. He didn't move from the window. "I have questions," he said, his voice quiet but intense. "And you will answer them." Alara froze, her hands hovering over the silver teapot. How could she answer? "You will not use your voice," he continued, as if reading her mind, "but you will answer nonetheless. Nod for yes, shake your head for no. It is a simple system. Do you understand?" She turned to face him and gave a small, hesitant nod. "Good." He crossed his arms over his powerful chest. "Last night, the wine, did you spill it on purpose?" Her breath caught. This was it. The moment of truth. To lie would be safer, but something in his gaze demanded honesty. She took a risk. She nodded. His expression didn't change, but the air in the room grew heavy, charged with unspoken energy. Why? She couldn't answer that. She couldn't mime poison or love potion. She could only stand there, trapped in her silence, her eyes pleading with him to understand. "Was there something wrong with the wine?" he pressed. She nodded again, more firmly this time. "Did Lady Seraphina do something to it?" A frantic, vigorous nod. Yes, she did. A muscle feathered in his jaw. He stared at her for a long, silent moment, his golden eyes boring into hers. The scent of ozone grew stronger, a sign of his agitation. He believed her. She could see it in the sudden hardening of his face, the dangerous glint in his eyes. "I see," he said softly. He walked over to the table and poured himself a cup of tea, his movements measured and controlled. "You are more observant than you appear, little shadow." He took a sip of tea, his gaze never leaving her. "This changes things. It seems I have a traitor in my court and a silent guardian in my chambers." He set the cup down with a soft click. "Your duties remain the same, but now you have one more. Watch. Listen. You are invisible to them. You will be my eyes and ears, and you will report to me. Understood?" She stared at him, stunned. He wasn't just intrigued by her. He was trusting her. He was giving her a purpose beyond scrubbing floors, a role that put her right in the center of the danger she had tried so desperately to avoid. It was terrifying, and it was the most thrilling thing that had ever happened to her. She gave a single, resolute nod. The days that followed settled into a strange and nerve-wracking routine. Alara became a fixture in the king's life, a silent presence from dawn until dusk. She brought his meals, tidied his chambers, and stood unobtrusively in the corner of his study while he met with advisors and generals. As he had predicted, the court quickly learned to ignore her. She was just a piece of furniture, the king's mute pet project. They spoke freely in front of her, their plots and flatteries laid bare. She learned more about the running of the kingdom in a week than she had in 6 years of scrubbing floors. She learned of the tensions with the southern pacts, the dwindling grain supplies, and the constant political maneuvering of the noble houses, and she learned just how deep Lady Seraphina's claws were in the court. Her family, the House of Blackwood, held significant influence, and Seraphina wielded it with cunning precision. Alara's nights were her only solace. She would steal away to her attic room, the scent of the king clinging to her clothes and hair, and work feverishly on the final nettle shirt. Her fingers, already scarred, would bleed anew as she plaited the burning fibers, her silent prayers woven into every stitch. The work grounded her, reminded her of her true purpose: save them, save your brothers. But the duality of her life was tearing her apart. In the castle, she was the king's shadow. In her room, she was a princess fighting a curse. And in her heart, she was a woman falling hopelessly in love with her fated mate, who was also her family's greatest enemy. The mate bond, now that they were in such close proximity, was a constant living entity between them. It was a low hum beneath her skin, a magnetic pull that made it a physical effort to stand across the room from him. His scent was a constant assault on her senses, sometimes making her dizzy with longing. She saw the way his eyes would follow her, the way his knuckles would turn white when another man, a guard, an advisor, spoke to her, even if it was just to ask her to fetch a scroll. His eyes flashed gold more and more frequently. It happened once when she was stoking the fire, and a log shifted, sending a shower of sparks onto the rug. Before she could even react, he had crossed the room in 2 silent strides, pulling her back and stamping out the embers with his boot. He had held her arm for a second too long, his thumb stroking the sensitive skin of her inner wrist, and his eyes had burned like twin suns. She had felt the heat of it sink straight into her soul. He never touched her otherwise, maintaining a strict, professional distance, but the space between them crackled with unspoken tension. He spoke to her often, asking her opinion on matters with the same yes or no system. He'd hold up 2 different tunics in the morning. "The black?" he'd ask, holding it up. She'd shake her head. "The gray?" A nod. He'd wear the gray. He seemed to value her silent counsel, a fact that infuriated anyone who noticed. Lady Seraphina noticed everything. Her hatred for Alara was a palpable force, a poisonous cloud that followed her through the corridors. She found ways to make Alara's life difficult, ordering her on pointless errands, making snide remarks just loud enough for her to hear. "I don't know what trinket the king sees in that silent stray," she'd sneer to her ladies-in-waiting. "Once he is my husband, I'll have her sent to the deepest, darkest scullery." One afternoon, Alara was carrying a heavy tray with the king's lunch. As she rounded a corner, Seraphina stepped out from an alcove, accidentally bumping into her. The tray clattered to the floor, scattering food and broken crockery everywhere. "Oh my," Seraphina said with false sweetness, "still so clumsy. You'd think the king would have tired of you by now." Alara knelt to clean up the mess, her cheeks burning with humiliation. She refused to look at Seraphina, refused to give her the satisfaction. "Don't worry," Seraphina purred, leaning down, her voice a venomous whisper. "His fascination will fade. He needs a queen, a powerful mate, not a broken little mouse. He will be mine, and you will be nothing. The scent of jasmine and dark magic was suffocating. Alara kept her eyes on the floor, gathering the broken pieces of pottery with trembling hands. A shard sliced her finger, and a drop of blood welled up, crimson against her pale skin. What is going on here? The king's voice was like a whip crack. Both women froze. He stood at the end of the corridor, his arms crossed, his face a thunderous mask. His gaze took in the scene, the spilled food, Alara on her knees, the bleeding cut on her finger, and Serafina standing over her, with a smug look that vanished the moment she saw him. His eyes locked onto the drop of blood on Alara's hand, and a low, guttural growl escaped his lips. It was not a human sound. It was the sound of a possessive, territorial alpha, and it made the torches on the walls flicker. Serafina took a frightened step back. "Your Majesty, it was an accident. The girl is simply inept." Kaelin ignored her completely. He strode forward and crouched in front of Alara. Without a word, he took her injured hand in his touch surprisingly gentle. He examined the cut, his expression grim. Then, he brought her finger to his lips and licked away the drop of blood. Alara's entire world tilted on its axis. His tongue was warm and soft against her skin. A bolt of pure, unadulterated energy shot up her arm and straight to her core, leaving her breathless and shaking. The small cut tingled and sealed over, the magic of an alpha's saliva healing the minor wound instantly. He met her wide, shocked eyes, and his own were molten gold, all pretense of control gone. The raw, undisguised desire in them stole the air from her lungs. Mine. The word wasn't in her head this time. It was in his eyes, in his touch, in the fierce, protective scent that billowed off him like a storm front. He slowly released her hand and rose to his feet, turning the full force of his fury on a pale and trembling Serafina. "Get out of my sight!" he snarled. Serafina didn't need to be told twice. She practically fled down the corridor. Kaelin stood for a moment, his chest rising and falling heavily as he brought his formidable temper under control. He looked down at Alara, still kneeling amidst the mess. "Leave this," he said, his voice softer now, but still strained. "The other servants will clean it. Come with me." He turned and walked back toward his chambers. After a moment of stunned paralysis, Alara scrambled to her feet and hurried to follow him, her heart a wild bird beating against the cage of her ribs. He had tasted her blood. He had healed her. In the world of shifters, these were not small things. They were acts of intimacy, of claiming, and everything had just become infinitely more complicated. Back in the sanctuary of his chambers, the air was thick with a tension so profound it felt like a physical weight. Kaelin paced before the fireplace, a caged wolf restrained by the thin veneer of his humanity. He hadn't spoken since the corridor, and the silence stretched, taut and fragile. Alara stood by the door, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, not daring to move, not daring to breathe. The spot on her finger where his mouth had been still burned with a phantom heat. His scent filled the room, pine and frost, sharpened by anger and something else. She couldn't quite name a frustrated, yearning desire that called to the deepest parts of her. It made her feel dizzy, vulnerable. Finally, he stopped pacing and turned to face her, his amber eyes blazing. "She has been tormenting you." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with a self-loathing growl, as if he were furious with himself for not seeing it sooner. Alara looked down at her feet, a silent confirmation. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded, taking a step closer. The foolishness of the question seemed to dawn on him the moment it left his lips. He raked a hand through his dark hair in frustration. "Right. The silence. It is a curse, isn't it?" Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. How could he know? Her secret was hers alone, a burden she had carried in absolute solitude for 6 long years. He saw the panic on her face, and his expression softened slightly. "I do not mean a literal curse," he clarified, though a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. "I mean it is a burden, something that holds you captive." He moved closer still, closing the distance between them until he was standing directly in front of her. He was so tall she had to crane her neck to look at him. "I would free you from it if I could." The sincerity in his voice was a physical blow. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and sudden. For 6 years no one had looked at her with anything other than pity, annoyance, or disdain. No one had seen her silence as a cage. They just saw it as an absence, a lack. But he saw her. He saw that she was trapped. A single tear escaped and traced a hot path down her cheek. Before she could wipe it away, his thumb was there, gently brushing it aside. His touch was electric, a brand against her skin. "Don't," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Do not cry. I cannot bear it." He didn't move his hand away. His thumb stroked her cheekbone, a slow, mesmerizing rhythm. His gaze dropped to her lips, and she saw the battle raging within him, the king versus the man, duty versus desire. The wolf. "I know I should not feel this," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "You are a servant, nameless, mute, everything my counsel warns me against. I need a political alliance, a powerful queen to stand beside me." He let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "They present me with princesses and high-born ladies, women who smell of ambition and expensive perfumes. And all my wolf wants is the scent of wildflowers and rain that follows you like a ghost." Her breath hitched. He smelled it. The scent she thought was buried beneath the lye and soap, the hidden scent of her true self, of the princess she once was. "Tell me to stop," he whispered, his forehead now resting against hers, his eyes closed. "Just shake your head. Give me some sign to step away before I do something we will both regret." She couldn't. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her entire being was screaming at her to lean into him, to close the final torturous inch between their lips. Her hands, acting of their own accord, came up to rest on his chest. She could feel the frantic, powerful beat of his heart beneath her palms. It matched the rhythm of her own. This was madness. He was the conqueror of her people, the reason for her family's suffering, but he was also the man who saw her, the man who defended her, the man whose soul called to hers across a chasm of duty and secrets. He took her stillness as permission. His head tilted, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was a storm, a release of all the pent-up tension and frustration that had been simmering between them for weeks. It was desperate and hungry, a clash of teeth and a tangle of tongues. He tasted of mint and something uniquely his own, a wild masculine flavor that was utterly intoxicating. A strangled cry, the first sound she had made in years, was swallowed by his mouth. Her fingers curled, gripping the fabric of his tunic as she kissed him back with all the silent, pent-up yearning of her lonely existence. It was a kiss that spoke of grief and hope, of anger and a desperate, undeniable love. The mate bond flared between them, a supernova of light and heat and certainty. This was right. He was hers. She was his. He deepened the kiss, one hand sliding from her cheek to cup the back of her neck, pulling her impossibly closer. His other arm wrapped around her waist, lifting her against him until her feet were dangling off the floor. She felt consumed by him, by his strength, by his scent, by the overwhelming rightness of being in his arms. When he finally broke the kiss, they were both breathing heavily, their faces flushed. He rested his forehead against hers again, his golden eyes dark with a turbulent mix of emotions. "By the moon goddess," he breathed, his voice ragged. "What have you done to me, little shadow?" Before she could even begin to process what had just happened, a frantic pounding echoed from the chamber door. "Your Majesty, King Kaelin, an urgent message from the southern border," a guard's voice shouted. Kaelin stiffened, the spell between them shattering. The king was back, the moment of vulnerability gone. He gently set her back on her feet, but his eyes still held a possessive fire. He took a step back, putting a respectable distance between them, and smoothed down his tunic. "Enter," he commanded, his voice once again cool and authoritative. A guard burst in, his face pale and grim. "Your Majesty, it's the Red Claw Pack. They've breached the southern pass. They're leading a raid." Kaelin's entire demeanor shifted. The lover was gone, replaced by the warrior king. His face became a mask of cold fury. "How many?" "A war party, sire. At least 50. They've already hit the village of Stone Creek. Sound the alarm." "Ready, my guard," Kaelin snapped. "I ride at once." He turned and strode toward the armor stand in the corner of the room, shrugging off his tunic. Alara's eyes widened at the sight of his bare torso, a landscape of corded muscle and old scars. He began strapping on his leather armor with practiced efficiency. His eyes met hers in the reflection of a polished shield. The heat from their kiss still lingered, but it was now overshadowed by the cold chill of impending battle. He was going to fight. He could be hurt. He could be killed. The thought was a physical pain, a knife twisting in her gut. The slow-acting poison Seraphina had been administering, had it all been flushed from his system? Was he at his full strength? Doubt and fear warred within her. As he finished with his armor and grabbed his sword, he paused in front of her. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her again, a warrior's farewell. Instead, he reached out and tucked a stray strand of her hair behind her ear, his touch lingering for a fraction of a second. "Stay within these chambers. Do not leave them for any reason," he ordered, his voice low and firm. "It is the only place I know you will be safe." And then he was gone, sweeping out of the room like a storm, his guards falling into step behind him. Alara rushed to the window, her heart pounding. She watched as he mounted his massive black warhorse in the courtyard below, his presence commanding, his authority absolute. He gave a sharp command, and the entire party thundered out of the castle gates, a wave of steel and fury. She stayed at the window long after they had disappeared from sight, her hand pressed against her lips, the ghost of his kiss still tingling there. He had told her to stay safe, but a horrifying thought began to take root in her mind. What if the raid wasn't a coincidence? What if it was a diversion, orchestrated by someone who knew the king would ride out to meet it? Someone who wanted him weakened and vulnerable, far from the safety of his castle. Someone like Lady Seraphina. The poison was meant to weaken him, to make him vulnerable in a fight. This was the moment. This was the attack she had been poisoning him for. He was riding into a trap, and she was the only one who knew it. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the warm afterglow of his kiss. Kaelin was riding into an ambush, his strength already compromised by a poison she couldn't name. Her warning had been a single, silent nod. It wasn't enough. He had believed her about the wine, but he didn't know the extent of Seraphina's treachery. He didn't know the poison was a lingering, insidious thing, designed to sap his alpha vitality over time. His order echoed in her mind. Stay within these chambers. It was a command born of a desire to protect her, but staying here, safe and sound while he rode into mortal danger, felt like a betrayal. Her love for him, a feeling she had just acknowledged in the fire of his kiss, was not a passive thing. It was fierce, protective. It demanded action. She looked around the king's chambers, her mind racing. What could she do? She was a servant, a mute. No one would listen to her. Then her eyes fell on the small satchel she carried with her everywhere, hidden beneath her apron. Inside was a small, half-finished bundle of nettle fibers and a wooden needle. Her salvation, her curse. The nettles, the plant that caused her so much pain, held the key to her brother's freedom. But her grandmother, the hedge witch who had taught her the lore, had also spoken of the plant's other properties. It was a plant of purification, of fire and blood. It could be used to draw out toxins, to fight dark magic. The remedy, however, was as painful as the affliction. A desperate, terrifying plan began to form in her mind. She couldn't fight with a sword, but she could fight with the knowledge she possessed. She ran from his chambers, ignoring his direct order. The corridors were in a state of controlled chaos, servants rushing to and fro, guards reinforcing the castle gates. No one paid her any mind. She slipped out a side entrance, making her way to the royal stables. The stable master, a gruff old man named Torvin, looked up as she entered. "What do you want, girl? This is no place for you." She couldn't ask for a horse. He would never give one to her. So she had to take one. Her eyes scanned the stalls, looking for a mount that was swift but not too spirited. She found one, a dappled gray mare, saddled and ready, likely for a messenger. Perfect. While Torvin was distracted by a young stable hand, Elara moved with a speed and stealth that would have surprised anyone who knew her as the clumsy servant girl. She untied the mare's reins, her heart hammering against her ribs. She led the horse to the mounting block, her movements quick and sure. She had grown up on horseback. It was a skill, like her own name, that she had been forced to forget. She swung herself into the saddle, the familiar feel of the leather a small comfort. She gathered the reins, her hands not trembling in the slightest. In this moment, she was not the quiet one. She was Princess Elara of Silverwood, and she was riding to save her king, her mate. She kicked the mare into a canter, heading out of the stables and toward the postern gate, a smaller, less guarded exit. The guards there shouted in surprise as she galloped past them, but they were too slow to stop her. Once free of the castle walls, she urged the mare into a full gallop, following the fresh tracks of the king's war party. The wind whipped her hair back from her face and tore at her simple dress. She rode hard, pushing the horse and herself to their limits. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. She had to reach them before full dark. An hour of frantic riding later, she heard it, the clang of steel on steel, the roars of fighting men, the snarls of wolves in their shifted form. She slowed the mare, dismounting and tethering it to a tree before creeping forward on foot. Through the trees, she saw the scene of the battle. It was an ambush, just as she had feared. The Red Claw warriors were numerous, more than the initial report had suggested, and they fought with a savage desperation. Kalen was in the thick of it, a whirlwind of deadly grace. His greatsword was a blur of silver, cutting down one enemy after another, but he was tiring. She could see it. His movements were a fraction slower than they should have been, his breathing more labored. The poison was doing its work. Then she saw him. The Red Claw Alpha, a brute of a man with a scarred face and a cruel sneer, was circling Kalen, waiting for an opening. As Kalen dispatched another warrior, the Alpha lunged, his own sword swinging in a vicious arc. Kalen turned to block, but he was too slow. The sword sliced across his side, a deep, brutal gash. Kalen roared in pain and staggered back, clutching his wound. Blood, dark and slick, poured between his fingers. The Red Claw Alpha laughed, raising his sword for the killing blow. Time seemed to slow down. Elara didn't think. She acted. She ran from the cover of the trees, straight into the heart of the battle. She ignored the fighting around her, her eyes fixed only on Kalen. She reached him just as the enemy Alpha swung his sword. With a desperate cry that was nothing more than a choked gasp of air, she threw herself in front of Kalen. She couldn't stop the sword, but she could change its target. Instead of sinking into Kalen's heart, the blade sliced deeply into her shoulder. The pain was blinding, a white-hot agony that stole her breath and sent her crumpling to the ground. Her last conscious thought was of Kalen's face, his eyes wide with horror and disbelief, his mouth forming her name, a name he shouldn't know, a name he couldn't have said. Elara. Then, darkness claimed her, but the darkness was not absolute. It was pierced by a roar of pure, untamed fury. It was a sound that shook the very trees, the sound of an alpha whose mate had been struck down before his eyes. It was the sound of Kalen, and it was the last thing the Red Claw Alpha ever heard. When Elara awoke, it was to pain. Her shoulder was a universe of fire. She was lying on a bed of furs, in what looked like a hastily made camp. A fire crackled nearby, casting flickering shadows on the trees. Kalen was kneeling beside her, his face pale and grim beneath the grime of battle. His own wound on his side had been crudely bandaged, but his attention was entirely on her. He was pressing a wad of cloth against her shoulder, trying to staunch the bleeding. "Stay with me," he commanded, his voice thick with a desperate urgency she had never heard before. That was the act of a fool, a brave, beautiful fool. "Don't you dare leave me." She tried to speak, to tell him about the poison, but only a pained breath escaped her. She looked down at her wound, then pointed a trembling finger at the gash in his side. She tried to convey the danger with her eyes. He seemed to understand. "My wound is deep, but it is clean. Yours." His voice broke. "The blade was poisoned, a slow-acting toxin meant for me. It works faster on a human." A human. He thought she was human. Of course he did. Her wolf had been suppressed for so long, buried under the weight of her curse and her grief, that her scent was faint, easily mistaken. She knew what she had to do. The pain in her shoulder was a roaring fire, but the thought of the poison spreading through his veins was worse. She reached for the satchel that was still, miraculously, slung over her uninjured shoulder. Her fingers fumbled with the clasp, her vision swimming. She pulled out the bundle of raw, stinging nettles. Kalen watched her, his expression confused. "What are you doing?" She ignored him, her movements clumsy but determined. She took a handful of the vicious, stinging leaves. Ignoring the fresh agony as their tiny needles pierced her skin, she crushed them in her fist, creating a rough, green poultice. Then, she reached for him, her intention clear. She was going to apply it to his wound. He caught her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. "No, what is that? It will hurt you." She met his gaze, her eyes pleading. She put the poultice against her own bleeding hand first, showing him, then pointed again at his wound. "Trust me." He stared at her, a war of logic and instinct on his face. He was a king, a warrior. He knew poisons and remedies, and he knew that nettles were for stinging, not for healing. But he also saw the desperate certainty in her eyes. He saw the woman who had taken a sword for him. Slowly, he released her wrist. He pulled back the bandage on his side, exposing the angry, inflamed wound. A faint black line was already spreading from it, a telltale sign of dark poison. With a deep, steadying breath, Elara pressed the poultice of crushed nettles directly into his open wound. Kalen roared, a raw animal sound of pure agony. His body arched off the furs, his muscles cording as the nettles did their fiery work, burning, stinging, but also drawing the poison to the surface. It was an excruciating, brutal remedy. But through the haze of her own pain, Elara saw it. The black lines in his skin began to recede. The fiery red of the inflammation lessened. It was working. She held the poultice in place, her hand trembling, tears of pain and relief streaming down her face. Kaelin's head fell back onto the furs, his chest heaving, sweat beading on his brow. His golden eyes, clouded with pain, found hers. "You are saving me," he rasped, his voice filled with a stunned, profound awe. She could only offer a weak, watery smile in return before her own pain became too much. The world began to spin, the edges of her vision turning dark. She slumped forward, her strength finally giving out, collapsing against his chest as unconsciousness claimed her once more. Consciousness returned to Elara in slow, painful waves. The first thing she registered was the scent, not the metallic tang of blood or the smoky air of the battlefield, but the clean, crisp aroma of linen and herbs, and beneath it all, the intoxicating, ever-present scent of pine and frost. Kaelin's scent. She forced her heavy eyelids open. She was in his bed, the massive, four-poster bed in his chambers, tucked beneath soft, heavy furs. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, indicating it was late morning. Her shoulder was tightly bandaged, the pain reduced to a dull, throbbing ache. Her simple servant's dress had been replaced with a soft, clean nightgown. Kaelin was sitting in a chair beside the bed, watching her. He looked exhausted. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and a day's worth of stubble darkened his jaw, but he was alive. He was whole. His side was bandaged, but he sat upright, his posture strong. The poison was gone. When he saw, her eyes were open. A wave of palpable relief washed over his face. He leaned forward, taking her uninjured hand in both of his. His touch was warm and grounding. "You're awake," he breathed, his voice rough. The castle healer said the sword was tipped with shadow venom. He said you were lucky. He doesn't know how you survived. "I am not human," she wanted to say. My wolf, however weak, fought it off, but she could only squeeze his hand in response. "He also doesn't know how I survived," Kaelin continued, his golden eyes searching hers. "He said the poison in my wound should have been fatal within hours, but when my guards brought us back, it was gone. All that was left was a clean cut and blisters from the nettles." He shook his head in disbelief. "You saved my life. You knew exactly what to do. Who are you?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy and dangerous. She was Princess Elara, daughter of a king he had slain, sister to princes he held captive. She was his enemy, and she was his mate. The truth would destroy everything. She pulled her hand away and pushed herself up, wincing as a sharp pain shot through her shoulder. She had to get back to her room, to her work. The final shirt was so close to being finished. Time was running out. "No," he said, his voice firm as he gently pushed her back against the pillows. "You will rest. That is an order." He stood and began to pace, the familiar habit returning as he wrestled with his thoughts. The raid was a setup. The Red Claw Alpha admitted it before he died. He was paid by a woman at court, a woman with a serpent's tongue and the scent of jasmine. Seraphina. "She has been arrested," Kaelin said, his voice turning to ice. "She is in the dungeons, stripped of her titles and her magic. She confessed to everything, the poison, the raid, the lies. She will stand trial for high treason." He stopped pacing and looked at Elara, his expression one of profound self-recrimination. "I was a fool. I was so blinded by my duty, by the need for a political match, that I did not see the snake in my own den. And you saw it from the very beginning. You tried to warn me. You took a sword for me." He walked back to the bed and sat on the edge, his proximity making her heart race. He reached out, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw. "I don't care who you were before you came to this castle," he said, his voice low and intense. "I don't care that you cannot speak. I don't care about alliances or politics, or what my council will say." His eyes burned with a fierce, unwavering conviction. "I know what my heart knows. I know what my wolf has been screaming since the first moment I saw you. You are my mate. Nothing else matters." Tears welled in Alara's eyes. This was everything she had ever dreamed of hearing. The words were a balm to her wounded soul, but they were also a death sentence. How could he claim her, love her, when he learned the truth, when he discovered she was the daughter of the man whose death he had orchestrated? The hatred between their people ran too deep. To protect him, to protect the fragile hope that was blooming in her chest, she had to reject him. It was the most painful thing she had ever had to do. She shook her head, a small, jerky movement, but the meaning was unmistakable. "No." Kaelin recoiled as if she had struck him. The light in his eyes dimmed, replaced by a look of stunned hurt. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking. You do not feel it? The pull? The bond?" She had to be cruel to be kind. She forced her expression to become cold, empty. She shook her head again, more firmly this time, and pulled away from his touch. The pain on his face was a physical thing, a wound far deeper than any sword could make. The scent of pine and frost in the room became sharp, brittle, like ice shattering. It was the scent of heartbreak. I see," he said, his voice hollow. He stood up, his regal posture returning like a suit of armor. The king was back, hiding the wounded man. "I have misunderstood. My apologies." The formal words were like daggers in her own heart. "You are a hero to this kingdom. You will be rewarded. A house, gold, anything you desire. You will no longer be a servant." He turned to leave, his shoulders stiff. He was accepting her rejection. He was letting her go. Panic clawed at her throat. This wasn't what she wanted. She wanted to scream the truth, to tell him everything. But the vow held her tongue, and her fear held her heart. If she told him now, Seraphina's trial would become entangled with the revelation of a lost princess. His court was already unstable. Her existence could shatter it completely, and his enemies would use it against him. She had to wait. She had to finish the last shirt. But as he reached the door, she couldn't let him leave like this. She slid out of the bed, her legs unsteady, and hurried after him. She grabbed his arm, her touch hesitant. He stopped but didn't turn around. "What is it?" he asked, his voice cold and distant. She moved in front of him, forcing him to look at her. She reached up, her hand trembling, and placed it on his chest, right over his heart. She held his gaze, trying to pour all of her unspoken feelings into her eyes. "It's not what you think. Please, just wait. Trust me." He looked down at her hand, then back to her face. A flicker of hope warred with the hurt in his eyes. "I don't understand you," he whispered. "One moment you kiss me like you're drowning and I'm air, and the next you push me away. What do you want from me?" She had no answer she could give. She could only stare at him, her heart breaking, and pray to the goddess that he would understand. But the moment was broken by the arrival of Steward Boren, who entered without knocking, his face a mask of grim importance. "Your Majesty," he said, his eyes flicking from the king to Alara and back again, a flicker of disapproval in his gaze. "The council is assembled. They demand a verdict for Lady Seraphina. And they are insisting you announce your betrothal, to solidify the court. They say the kingdom needs a queen, now more than ever." Kaelin's jaw tightened. He looked at Alara, his eyes filled with a desperate, questioning plea. He was giving her one last chance to stop this, to give him a reason to fight his counsel, and she couldn't. With a heart that felt like it was turning to stone, she dropped her hand from his chest and took a step back, lowering her eyes to the floor. It was a gesture of submission, a gesture of finality. She felt the hope die in him. The air grew cold. "Very well, steward," Kalen said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "Let us go and give the council what they want." He walked out of the room, without a backward glance, leaving Alara alone in the center of the vast chamber, the silence more deafening than it had ever been before. She had protected him by breaking both their hearts. The days that followed were a special kind of hell. As promised, Alara was moved from her tiny attic space to a comfortable suite of rooms in the main castle keep. She was no longer a servant. She was lauded as a hero, the king's savior, a title that felt like ash in her mouth. Servants now bowed to her. Nobles offered her strained, polite smiles, and gifts of fine clothes and jewels piled up in her rooms, all of them feeling like gilded shackles. She wanted none of it. She wanted her attic room, her anonymity, and the stolen moments of tension and longing with Kalen. But Kalen was gone. Not physically, she saw him at court, from a distance, but the man who had kissed her, who had called her his mate, had vanished. In his place was the Alpha King, a remote and formidable figure. He never looked at her. He never acknowledged her presence. When their paths crossed in the crowded corridors, he would look straight through her, his face a mask of cold indifference. The rejection she had feigned had been accepted as truth, and he had locked his heart away from her. The wound in her shoulder healed, but the one in her soul festered. The castle felt like a prison, and the silence she had once borne with stoic resolve now felt like a suffocating shroud. Worse yet were the whispers. The court was abuzz with news. Lady Seraphina had been found guilty of treason and sentenced to life imprisonment in the Blackrock mines, her magic permanently bound. And, to stabilize the kingdom after the scandal, the council had successfully pressured Kalen into a political betrothal. He was to marry Lady Astrid of the Stonecrest Pack, a powerful neighboring ally. The wedding was set to take place in 1 week. Each new detail was another twist of the knife in Alara's heart. She would watch from the castle battlements as Lady Astrid arrived with her entourage, a beautiful, proud she-wolf with hair the color of spun gold. She saw the way Astrid looked at Kalen, with open adoration and ambition, and she saw the way Kalen looked at Astrid, with polite, detached courtesy. There was no spark, no fire, no soul-deep connection. He was doing his duty. Alara's only escape was her work. Every night, she would lock the door to her lavish new rooms and pull the final unfinished shirt from its hiding place. She worked with a frantic, desperate energy, her tears falling onto the nettle fibers as she wove. Her hands were raw, her fingers perpetually bleeding, but she barely felt the pain. It was nothing compared to the agony in her chest. She had to finish. It was her only hope. Once her brothers were free, once the curse was broken and her voice was returned, she could tell him the truth. She could explain everything. She clung to that fragile hope, fanning its embers in the darkness of her despair. 3 days before the royal wedding, she was visited by Lena. Her friend entered the room, her face etched with worry. "I had to see you," Lena said, rushing to her side. "The whole castle is talking about the king. He's not himself, Alara. He's like a ghost. He eats nothing. He barely sleeps. He just works and trains. He's pushing himself to the breaking point." Lena's voice dropped to a whisper. "They say he's broken-hearted, that the king's savior he honored rejected him." Alara flinched, the words striking their intended target. "Is it true?" Lena asked, her eyes soft with concern. "Did you turn him away?" Alara could only nod. a fresh wave of tears blurring her vision. She gestured around the room, at the fine things, then pointed to her own throat, a look of desperation on her face. I had to. I can't explain. Lena seemed to understand. There's something you're not telling anyone, she murmured. A secret. She looked at Alara's bandaged hands. A painful one. A sudden, terrible thought struck Alara. She grabbed a piece of parchment and a charcoal stick from the writing desk. Her hands shaking, she drew a crude picture of 6 swans, then a picture of a crown. She looked at Lena, her eyes wide with a silent plea. Lena's brow furrowed in confusion. Swans? What does this mean? Alara's shoulders slumped. It was no use. Her secret was too complex, too fantastic to be communicated through gestures and drawings. She was utterly alone in this. The day of the wedding arrived, a bright, beautiful day that mocked the darkness in Alara's heart. The castle was alive with celebration. Banners flew from the ramparts, music filled the air, and the scent of roasting meats and celebratory feasts was everywhere. It was a festival of her own personal misery. She had finished the shirt. The final stitch had been woven late last night, her fingers numb and bleeding. The 6 nettle shirts were now bundled together, hidden beneath her bed, a heavy, painful testament to her love and sacrifice. But how could she get them to her brothers? The enchanted lake, where they lived as swans, was half a day's ride from the castle. By the time she got there and back, Kaelin would be a married man, bound to another for life. It was over. She had failed. A knock on her door startled her. It was Steward Boren. His usual sour expression was replaced by one of grim duty. "The king requests your presence at the ceremony," he said, his tone flat. He insisted. "You are to sit in the honored guests section, in the front row." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. He was forcing her to watch, forcing her to witness the finality of her choice. It was a punishment, cold and deliberate. Dressed in a simple blue gown, a color that reminded her of her old uniform and simpler, more hopeful times, she allowed the steward to lead her to the great hall. It had been transformed. Flowers and silks adorned every surface. The entire court was assembled, dressed in their finest. She was seated in the front row, directly across the aisle from Lady Astrid's family. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, the whispers following her like flies. The king's rejected savior, the mute hero. Then the trumpets sounded. The massive doors at the end of the hall swung open, and King Kaelin walked in. He was magnificent, dressed in formal black and silver, his crown on his head. He was every inch the Alpha King, but his face was pale, his expression carved from stone. His eyes, when they swept over the crowd, were empty. They passed over her without a flicker of recognition. The bond between them was a cold, dead thing, a severed cord that ached with the memory of connection. He took his place before the elder, who would perform the ceremony. Then, the music swelled, and Lady Astrid began her walk down the aisle on the arm of her father. She was radiant, a vision in white and gold, smiling for her future subjects. This was it. The final moment. Alara's heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. She had to do something. Anything. As Astrid reached the altar and took her place beside Kaelin, Alara's gaze was drawn to the high, arched windows of the great hall. And then she saw them. 6 magnificent white swans, flying in perfect formation, heading directly for the castle. Her brothers, hope, fierce and desperate, exploded in her chest. They had come. Somehow, they knew. They knew she had finished her work. She couldn't wait. She couldn't let the elder speak the binding words. She stood up. A collective gasp went through the hall. Everyone turned to stare at her. Kaelin's head snapped in her direction, his eyes finally locking with hers. For the first time that day, his mask of indifference cracked. revealing a flash of confusion and pain. Ignoring the whispers, ignoring the glares, Alara lifted the hem of her dress and ran, not towards the door, but towards the dais, towards him. "What is the meaning of this?" Lady Astrid's father boomed. Guards moved to intercept her, but Kaelin held up a hand, his eyes never leaving Alara's. He watched as she ran to him, her face a mess of tears and desperate hope. She reached the dais and fell to her knees before him. She didn't have the shirts. They were in her room. All she had was this one, final, desperate chance. She opened her mouth. The vow, the curse, a physical barrier on her tongue. She focused all her will, all her love for her brothers, all her desperate, agonizing love for the man standing before her, and she pushed against it. She would break it with sheer force of will, or she would die trying. A searing pain, like a hot poker, lanced through her throat. A choked, strangled sound escaped her lips. And at that exact moment, the stained glass window high above the altar shattered inwards, and 6 enormous swans swooped into the great hall, landing amidst the terrified court with a great rush of wings. The entire hall descended into chaos. Chaos erupted. Women screamed, nobles scrambled for cover, and guards drew their swords, unsure of what to attack. The 6 swans stood regally amidst the panic, their intelligent eyes scanning the crowd, their long necks held high. They ignored everyone else, their collective gaze fixing on the small, kneeling figure at the foot of the dais. Alara saw them, and the sight gave her the last ounce of strength she needed. The pain in her throat was excruciating, but the vow was fraying, weakened by the proximity of her brothers and the completion of her task. "Stop!" The word was a croak, a raw, ragged sound torn from a throat that had been silent for 6 years. It was ugly and broken, but it was a word, her word. The hall fell silent. Every eye turned to her. Kaelin stared, his face a mask of utter shock, his mind clearly struggling to process the impossible. The mute girl had spoken, ignoring the searing pain. Alara pushed herself to her feet. She had to get the shirts. She turned to run back toward the hall's entrance, but a guard, recovering his wits, blocked her path. "Let her pass," Kaelin commanded, his voice ringing with an authority that no one dared defy. The guard immediately stepped aside. Alara ran as she had never run before, her formal gown tangling around her legs. She flew up the grand staircase, her lungs burning, her only thought to get the bundle of nettle shirts. She burst into her chambers, snatched the bundle from under the bed, and ran back, not caring who saw her carrying the strange, rough-spun garments. When she re-entered the great hall, the scene was a tableau of tense stillness. Her brothers, still in their swan forms, had moved to form a protective semicircle around the dais. Kaelin had not moved, his eyes fixed on the doors, waiting for her. Lady Astrid and her family looked on with a mixture of fear and fury. Alara walked down the aisle, her steps measured and certain now. She did not falter. She walked past the stunned nobles, past the confused guards, and straight to her brothers. One by one, she threw a nettle shirt over each of their feathered bodies. A blinding flash of golden light filled the hall, forcing everyone to shield their eyes. When the light faded, the swans were gone. In their place stood 6 tall, handsome men, with hair the color of wheat and eyes the color of a summer sky. They were dressed in the rough nettle shirts, but they wore them like royal raiment. "Alara," the eldest breathed, his voice filled with love and disbelief. He stepped forward and pulled her into a fierce hug. "You did it. You saved us." Her other brothers crowded around, hugging her, touching her face, their joy and relief a palpable wave. Alara pulled back, her gaze finding Kaelin's across the space. His face was a whirlwind of emotions: shock, confusion, dawning comprehension, and a sliver of hope that was so fragile she feared it might break. "Who are you?" he asked again, but this time the question was not born of idle curiosity. It was a demand for the truth that lay between them. She took a deep breath, her throat still aching. "My name is Alara," she said, her voice clearer now, stronger. "Princess Alara of the fallen kingdom of Silverwood." A tremor went through the assembled court. The lost princess, presumed dead, with the rest of the royal family 6 years ago. Her eldest brother, Prince Lorien, stepped forward, his eyes flashing with a cold anger as he looked at Kaelin. "And we are her brothers, the 6 princes of Silverwood, cursed by a witch in your service, and left to suffer while you claimed our father's throne." The accusation hung in the air like a death sentence. Kaelin's face paled. He looked from the princes to Alara, the pieces clicking into place. Her silence, her knowledge of herbs, her presence in his castle as a servant. It was a betrayal of a magnitude he had never imagined. "The witch," Kaelin said, his voice strained. "Seraphina." "The very same," Lorien confirmed. "She helped you conquer our kingdom, and in return, you gave her power and influence. You allowed her to curse us, to steal our lives, to torture our sister with a vow of silence that would only break when she completed an impossible task." Alara saw the agony on Kaelin's face. He had been a pawn in Seraphina's game, just as they had. He had unknowingly harbored the very witch who had destroyed her family. "I did not know," Kaelin said, his voice low and heavy with regret. He was not speaking to Lorien. He was speaking to Alara. "Goddess, Alara, I never knew." "This changes everything," boomed Lord Stonecrest, Astrid's father, stepping forward. "This woman is the heir of your enemy. This union cannot proceed." "I quite agree," Kaelin said, his voice turning to steel. He turned to a stunned Lady Astrid. "My lady, I am sorry for this public humiliation, but this marriage cannot happen. It was a mistake born of duty, not of heart. You will be compensated for this insult, and our alliance will stand. But I will not, cannot, marry you." Astrid stared at him, her pride wounded, but a flicker of understanding or perhaps relief at escaping such a complicated situation was in her eyes. She gave a curt, stiff nod. Kaelin's full attention returned to Alara. He took a step down from the dais, then another, until he was standing before her. Her brothers tensed, ready to defend her, but she held up a hand to stop them. "Alara," Kaelin began, his voice raw with a pain that mirrored her own. "Everything you have done, living here as a servant, the silence, the pain of the nettles, it was all for them." "Yes," she whispered. "And you kept your identity a secret, to protect them, and to protect me." The realization dawned in his eyes. "If your existence had been revealed, my enemies would have used you as a rallying point to start a civil war. You stayed silent to keep the peace of the kingdom that conquered yours." "I did," she admitted, tears welling. "And I rejected you because I am the daughter of the man you killed. I thought you could never. I thought you would hate me if you knew." "Hate you?" he asked, a broken, incredulous laugh escaping him. He reached out, his hands cupping her face, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "Alara, I am in awe of you. Your strength, your loyalty, your heart. I have done nothing but cause you pain, and you have done nothing but save me. From poison, from swords, from myself." His golden eyes pleaded with her. "My war with your father was just that, a war. It was a tragedy, born of old grievances and political necessity. It was not a war against you. I regret his death, but I will not regret the outcome that brought me to you. Can you forgive me?" Her brothers bristled, but Alara looked into his eyes and saw not a conqueror, but a man burdened by his crown, a man who was her mate. Her heart had known the truth long before her mind was willing to accept it. "There is nothing to forgive," she whispered. "Some things change. For the better." A slow, brilliant smile spread across his face, a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. "Is that a yes, then?" he asked, his voice thick with hope. "When I ask you, not as a king making an alliance, but as a man who cannot imagine another day without you, will you be my mate, my queen?" Before she could answer, a shriek of pure rage echoed from the gallery above. Lady Seraphina, her face contorted in a mask of fury, stood there, having somehow escaped her cell. In her hands, she held a shard of obsidian, and it glowed with a malevolent purple light. "If I cannot have him, no one will," she screamed, and she hurled a bolt of dark energy straight at Kaelin's heart. It all happened in an instant. Kaelin, caught off guard, couldn't have moved in time, but Alara could. The breaking of the curse had not just freed her voice, it had unbound her own latent magic, the royal magic of Silverwood, a power she never knew she possessed. As the bolt of dark energy flew toward them, Alara instinctively threw her hands up. A shield of shimmering, silver light erupted from her palms, meeting the purple bolt in mid-air. The two forces collided with a deafening explosion of energy that threw everyone backward. When the light cleared, the shield was gone, and so was the dark magic. Seraphina stood in the gallery, her power spent, just as the royal guards seized her. Alara swayed on her feet, dizzy from the sudden expenditure of energy. Kaelin caught her, pulling her securely against his chest. He held her tight, his face buried in her hair, breathing in her scent of wildflowers and rain. "I believe," he murmured into her ear, his voice shaking slightly. "You have saved me for the third time." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. "I think that means you're stuck with me." A laugh, bright and clear and free, bubbled up out of her. "I believe it does," she said. In front of her brothers, her former enemies, and the entire court, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss of their stolen moment, but a kiss of deep, profound love and promise. It was a new beginning. And as he kissed her, he lowered his head to the juncture of her neck and shoulder. She felt the sharp, pleasant sting of his teeth as he marked her, the claiming bite that sealed their bond forever. A wave of warmth and rightness flooded her, the final piece of her soul clicking into place. He was hers, she was his, and together they would build a new kingdom from the ashes of the old. 1 month later, Queen Alara stood on the private balcony of the royal chambers, a soft breeze ruffling her hair. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the sleeping kingdom. She wore a simple gown of silverwood blue, but a delicate silver crown, intertwined with carvings of swans and wolves, rested on her head. Strong arms wrapped around her waist from behind, and a familiar chin rested on her shoulder. The scent of pine and frost, now her favorite scent in the world, enveloped her. "You're up early, my love," Kaelin murmured, his lips brushing against her ear. She leaned back against his solid chest, her hand covering his. "I like watching the sunrise. It feels hopeful. Everything feels hopeful with you," he said, his voice sincere. He turned her in his arms to face him, his golden eyes soft and filled with an adoration that still made her heart skip a beat. "Are you happy here? I have my brothers back, their kingdom restored and allied with ours," she said, her voice full of wonder. Her brothers, with Kaelin's full support and resources, had returned to Silverwood and were in the process of rebuilding, forging a new era of peace and cooperation between the two once warring lands. "And I have you," How could I not be happy? He smiled, a genuine, easy smile that he seemed to wear permanently now. I'm glad, although, he added, a playful glint in his eye, I must admit, life was much quieter when you couldn't talk back. She laughed and swatted his chest lightly. You would be bored out of your mind. You loved solving the puzzle of me. That I did, he admitted, his smile widening. But I much prefer the solution. He became serious again, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. I spent so many years surrounded by people, yet I was utterly alone. The castle smelled of stone and duty, of loneliness. Then you came, and even in your silence, you brought the scent of life back into these walls. Wildflowers and rain, and you always smelled of a winter storm, she whispered, rising on her toes to kiss him softly. I think you just needed some spring, he chuckled, the sound a low, happy rumble in his chest. He pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers. They stood in comfortable silence for a long moment, simply breathing each other in, two souls finally at peace, finally home. You know, she said, a mischievous tone in her voice, Steward Boren is still terrified of you. But I think he's even more terrified of me now. Kaelin laughed aloud, the sound echoing in the crisp morning air. As he should be. You are the queen who shattered a window with swans, revealed a half-dozen lost princes, and defeated a dark witch with a flick of your wrist, all before you agreed to marry me. You are, by far, the most trouble of any queen this kingdom has ever known. And you love it, she teased. More than my own life, he confirmed, his voice dropping to a husky whisper. He kissed her again, deeply this time, a kiss that spoke of promises kept and a future that was brighter than any sunrise. Some things, she thought as she melted into his embrace, had to be broken before they could be healed. Some vows had to be shattered before the truth could be spoken, and some kingdoms had to fall so that a new, stronger one, built on forgiveness, sacrifice, and a love that defied curses could rise.